we're live. Welcome back to another episode of Comp and Coffee. Excited. It's a very special episode because there's not just three of us, but there's four of us today. So excited to have Matt with us, Bill with us, but also Heather. Heather, welcome to Comp and Coffee. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Russ.
Now, Heather, I have to ask. So as listeners may know, Matt, Bill, and myself, Russ here, we're all based in New England. But I have to ask, Heather, you're in Texas. Is it spring yet in Texas?
Oh my gosh, is it spring? We are a high of 77 today. I'm an avid gardener. Everything's in bloom. It's lovely here.
See, I'm jealous. Matt, has it stopped snowing yet? Because I had snow last week.
It's like there was snow last week. It's 60 today. It's typical New England weather here.
Yeah, it's mud. It's mud season here in New England. It's basically what it is. So yeah. So
let's
we
get
thought
to the mud.
Yes.
Into the dirt.
Yeah, exactly. You get just the part of the year where the snow's all melted and all the stuff over the course of the winter that built up in the snowbanks is now just trash on the side of the road. So basically, don't visit New England in the spring. That's not the time you come. Come in the fall. So anyway, last episode, some of you may remember, we talked about our comp best practices report, which had some really interesting numbers and some really interesting insights that we spent the entire time talking about. And some of you may have been thinking, well, those are really interesting, and maybe some of those are maybe a little counterintuitive. I wonder if other studies sort of reflect the same sort of trends. And it turns out Heather sent along this great bit of research that the Pew had done, Pew Research, about, again, why folks have been leaving. And it was a very recent study. Heather, what kind of drew your attention to this study from them?
I am probably subscribed to every HR newsletter that is out there. And so that's just how I spend my mornings. But this Pew Research caught my eye because it was very much around the employee experience. And to me, it provided a little bit more of the human context behind the Great Resignation. And that's how it was presented in one of the newsletters I was reading. So hearing about why people quit, we talk a lot about the quitting that's happening, but the why was super interesting.
Yeah, it was an interesting study, and I'm curious what you guys think about this, Bill and Matt, in particular, around the sample they chose. So this is fairly recent. They actually did the research and the survey back in February of this year, so February 7th through 13th, 2022. They talked to over 6,600 non-retired U.S. adults. Of that group, 965 said that they left their job by choice last year. Bill, what do you think about that sample? Is that a good sample? Is that where do you think there might be any data bias hiding out in there somewhere?
It is a pretty good size sample. The what Pew does, and for those that aren't familiar with them, they're like Gallup and Nielsen, and so they're in the business of polling, and what they do is they build a cohort that mirrors the population of the country. So the idea is that you can have a smaller total pool and still be representative. It doesn't eliminate bias, but it's trying to minimize bias. So it is decent. And this is sort of akin to when, there are presidential elections and they can have high confidence with 1,000 people they talk to. So I think the results are pretty good. Where it starts to fall apart, though, is not probably bad terminology, where it starts to get tough, and they actually say this in the article, is when you start slicing and dicing by lots of different groups. When you start looking at, white people versus people of color, they feel confident. But as they start going into different types of people of color, Black versus Hispanic versus Native American, they don't have enough data in each group to be able to report the differences between those groups, because now you're getting smaller and smaller samples. But overall, it's good. And again, directionally correct and interesting, and worth continuing. So we should not stop the podcast right now. We should keep going.
Oh, good. Whew. I was worried because if you'd said, no, this is terrible data, then it would have been a really short episode. So I'm glad.
Time to start our weekend a little early.
That's right. We could just get right to doing the garden for Heather there. We could all fly down to Texas and do some planting.
Yeah, but the poor people commuting to work would then have to flip to the radio.
Yep. So these kind of articles, when they come out, right, you got to have the clickbait. You got to have the headline that's like, oh my God, I got to read this article. Sort of, Heather, what was sort of the big sort of headline here? What was their big positioning at the title of this thing as to what they discovered?
So working for PayScale, I love the title. The majority of people quit in 2021 because pay was too low. That was the big takeaway. And to me, it was a fascinating moment where we figured out that it's as though workers figured out, the same wisdom that applies to selling a house applies to when's the best time to get a new job, when supply is low and demand is high. So seeing that play out in research was a very interesting thing. And to your point, clickbait headline, it was one of those clickbait headlines where you're like, well, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, what else does this research tell us?
Yeah, and I was interested in their position. Matt, I know, as we talk to clients and we think about these sorts of things, I know a lot of clients have said, I need more current market data. I need to really see what's going on in the market. Do you think that this sort of research is driving some of that? Do you think that our clients have been sort of intrinsically experiencing this, and this is sort of what's driving a lot of those requests?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think when we take a look into this data, though, I think this will be interesting for our conversation is where are these employees, these people who left their jobs, how are they feeling that they're being underpaid or pay was too low? Is it what others are making within the same role at their company? Is it other job offers are out there? Do they just feel like they're paid too low and they're not valued at their company and they're not putting it against another number? So I think that's some of the interesting stuff to get into as well.
I'll partially answer that.
Go, Bill. Yeah, go, Bill.
And add one more category, which is that they feel like they can't, like their pay isn't going up as fast as their expenses, and that, as inflation creeps in, your pay doesn't have to, if your pay doesn't keep up, then you're going backwards. You can buy less with your salary. And therefore you start thinking, maybe I should look for another job, or maybe I should ask for a raise. And the funny part, economics 101 here, is that as companies give people bigger raises than normal, their own costs to their customers go up, which then causes more employees to need more money. So that's sort of the battle with inflation. Is the way you stop inflation is by saying inflation's going to stop, and then people stop worrying about ever increasing prices. And I think that, one more category of why people are leaving is because they find out, like the person that, at the next desk, the next office just got a new job for 20% more. It's like word of mouth. It travels fast. Heather?
Yeah, no. So your two comments are really, in my mind, both around like rhetoric. The fact that we've been talking about the Great Resignation throughout the course of 2021, it's self-fulfilling in a sense, much like inflation, as you're describing.
Yeah,
the more you talk about it, the more real it is, and the more.
Yeah, well, it really, Heather, I love your housing market analogy, right? So it's kind of like you start thinking about selling your house, maybe if you start to there's a lot of data points just hitting you constantly that the market's going up, right? Like you can look on services like Zillow, or your neighbor tells you, hey, I just sold my house, or you see a house sign for sale come up and then it's sold the next day, and you start realizing, look at all these data points. I kind of wonder too if some of this is we're in comp. There's a lot of data points now out there, right? Not only is there to your point, Heather and Bill, the constant conversation about the Great Resignation, but you also have a lot of activities going on in the market in general that is forcing comp to be seen more often. More and more of these states are requiring job postings have salaries in them. More and more organizations are getting more aggressive about compensation. So maybe it's not your company, but your friend's company just gave out large merit increases, and you're hearing about that. So more and more people are talking about it, and so just the buzz, right, is making everybody go, "What? Shouldn't I be looking?" I have been kind of annoyed with my house. Maybe I should say, my job's not my favorite thing. Maybe I should look more. And we like to say in comp a lot, don't always throw money at the problem. But I think the other part to this whole flavor is, but if you're really under market, you better do something because the people are gonna leave.
I think you're right, Russ. But also the first part of that you were hinting at, throwing money at the problem. I think what I'm hearing from clients is, yes, they're taking a look to see if they're paying too low for some positions, making sure they're competitive with market. But then the sort of thing that they're pivoting to and focusing more on is pay transparency. So a lot of times you have these employees that leave for another job that maybe they're getting a higher base, but the total rewards package isn't as much. And they see that first number and they leave because of that. And so I think companies are investing more time now in ways to be more transparent with pay and what people are getting, what the ranges are, what your total rewards package is for the position that you have, so that employees are educated before they go and make decisions, life-changing decisions of leaving an organization and starting a new job.
And it's important to do that before the person says they're leaving, because once they've gotten that far, it's hard to, change direction for the person. They've already mentally committed to leaving, so you want to make sure they understand what you're giving them so that they're less inclined to look or less inclined to fall for, a single component of a big offer versus, something that's ultimately much better.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I think is complicating about that, or just an observation, to Bill's earlier comment about when you start to slice and dice the data because of sample sizes, it gets a little tricky, but pay transparency and total rewards. If you look at the sample or the sample of respondents, they skew a little young. 37% of the people who are participating in this Pew research are 18 to 29. And at 18 to 29, a lot of the benefits that go into total rewards and, part of those broader pay transparency, but full package conversations, are they enticing to, in general, healthy young people who are childless? Benefits don't appeal as much. What do they think about maternity and paternity perks and things like that? That's not a perk. Way wrong word there. Benefit.
No, that's absolutely right. And it's like, how many people out there know, you're right out of college, you're 20 somethings, they don't even participate in the 401k. They would rather have cash in their pocket. Same with maternity or paternity leave. Just, we've all heard that. Can I just get cash instead?
Yeah. I mean, I think back to when I started working out of college, and my biggest concerns were being able to have money to go out with my friends and being able to eat out so I don't have to cook. That's pretty much it. So I needed cash at that point.
And I think that's a great point about the demographic, the age of the demographic, Heather, because the second biggest, and it was really almost tied for first, right? Because in addition to 63% saying, hey, a big challenge for me, and the reason I'm thinking of leaving was pay was too low. Also, pretty much tied with that was 63% also said, well, it was because of no opportunities for advancement, right? So if you think of the two things we talked about there, one was pay transparency, companies getting aggressive about that, which is great. But as soon as you're transparent on pay and you see what market is, the only way to understand how to get more is to advance. But then also if you're a younger demographic, that's pretty much what's front and center for them. How do I build my career path? How do I establish credibility? How do I get that great looking LinkedIn profile and resume? And how do I do that? Right. So Heather, did that surprise? That almost tied for first statistic surprise you at all?
So what jumped out to me about that observation was thinking about connecting what we're seeing here in this data and this comment about no opportunities for advancement to the reality of the last 2 years of the remote working environment. Is there in fact no opportunity for advancement, or is it more so driven by a feeling of disconnection from the workplace? So I think in a previous Comp and Coffee, the three of you were talking about the idea of, being next to one another in a Zoom square versus in the office. That feels a lot different in terms of who you're learning from, how you're connected to the business. And so the no opportunities for advancement one, yeah, I think there's some legitimacy to that because the whole sample isn't young. There are, just over 40% or just over 60% of the sample is over 29, but there's a little bit of, we've all been stuck in our houses for the last 2 years. Are we really aware of all the opportunities in the business? And is HR doing a good enough job about career opportunities and advancement in light of every other challenge that organizations have faced during this time?
Bingo. Like I would say, like for the 20 somethings, you put on your empathy hat. There may be opportunities for advancement, but they're not seeing it as they're sitting in their Zoom square, like on the side of their bed in their apartment because their roommate's in the living room. They like, and they're, sort of the "what have you done for me lately" generation, looking for advancement quickly. They don't want to wait 2 years to get promoted. That, it's more like 2 months and they want to be promoted. It's an exaggeration, but that the HR issue challenge is to make them feel like they have a future and that the future is different from the present. So just because they're saying there are no opportunities, that means that they don't see the opportunities. Doesn't mean they're not there, but it means we as the employer are failing, at least failing that group.
Yeah, for sure. And I think what's interesting about these first two, right? So pay is low and opportunities. And you could argue that those two things are somewhat related because you've got good pay transparency, opportunity is sort of the next thing you think about. But this third one's sort of interesting. And Matt, I kind of wanted your take on this, maybe kick us off on this one. Third place on the survey as to why people leave is 57% of folks said disrespected was a primary influencer for them. So what's your take on that, Matt? Is that, does pay influence that in any way? Does being underpaid feel like a disrespecting, or is this a completely different corporate culture sort of situation, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, when I read through the breakout of the stats on this, I saw that one, and I feel like you got to attribute a lot of that back to the number one reason, that pay was too low. I feel like for most people in the workplace, not everyone, of course, but a lot of people, pay is one of the main ways that an organization can show you that they value you. And if you feel like you're being underpaid, you're going to feel disrespected. So I think there has to be a large sample of that group that would tie that then back to pay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Heather, go ahead.
At the beginning of 2020, I think it was mid 2020, Josh Bersin put out this piece on connecting the employee experience to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It was an interesting point of view of what aspects of HR relate to which rungs, so to speak, of Maslow's pyramid. And salary was at the bottom. Physical needs, safety being met, you need to get those things right before you can get to those higher order activities like engagement in the organization, commitment to the business, personal growth and career pathing. So, feeling disrespected at work, if you're not getting the basics right, you're not going to make it to culture. That comes back to that whole get pay right thing that we've been talking about for years.
Do you think that in sort of talking through this and feeling disrespected at work during COVID times, we've all been working remotely for the most part. The majority of these people probably were. It's harder to celebrate wins, growth within the organization when you're not in an office. You're sending out emails, you're doing it in Slack and stuff like that. So maybe organizations haven't placed a high enough value on that. So then, employees throughout the organization don't feel as respected because in the past, maybe you're in the office, you're having parties, you're celebrating big wins, you're walking by people, a manager, pat someone on the back, in the office to say great job on something. And we don't have those opportunities when we're all sitting at home.
I really do think there's something to that, particularly in the office environment. But I think if you balance that too with the frontline experience as well, because for a lot of service industry workers, the remote experience was challenging, yes, but we all did our jobs on computers sitting next to each other in an office building, you really accomplish most of what you do at home. But on the frontline situation where you have to go in, education, manufacturing, healthcare, like those are present environments. And if in the stress and chaos of 2020 and 2021, there's still an expectation of going into work and in volatile environments, and you forget about recognition, I think that's really part of where disrespect comes in as well. Of this is an unprecedented event in the world. There are many industries where being there is a requirement. And if we're not taking those extra steps, then I don't know how you walk away from that at the end of each day and not feel a little disrespected, like that you're going above and beyond.
Yeah, like when you think about nurses, doctors, healthcare, employees throughout all of this, they had to have felt disrespected. They're coming in and risking their lives in many cases. And it's then hard for the health system, the hospital, to celebrate them while all this is going on, to make sure that they feel respected and valued.
Well, and you also have like the retail and hospitality frontline workers,
Yep.
Who are, having their hours changed, having their customers come in and being disrespectful. It's not just the employer, but it's the customers being disrespectful. So I think that actually contributes a decent amount to this number. And that's why, those are the people that had to find new jobs because they weren't getting enough hours or weren't getting any hours and had to move to something different as the restaurants were closed, the hotels were closed, et cetera.
Yeah, I often wonder too, when you think about some of the terminology was being thrown around, especially early in the pandemic, around like essential workers and hazard pay and incentive pay. And if, I think a lot of people on the front lines probably didn't get as much respect as they wanted to, but also think about the fact that when people say to you, well, you're actually not essential, so we're not going to give you any incentive pay. We're not going to give you any hazard pay. Like kind of thought I was essential, so that all that terminology and all that framework too, if you weren't really careful about how you tackle that, it could also sort of lead to some of these places as well. So I think we're all still sort of wrestling with some of that. Bill, I'm really curious. So I had this as we're making a little behind the curtain thing here. So we make show notes before we just from talking points, things we want to talk about. And I had this last little bullet, like, hey, there's like a few other things on the list below being disrespected. And here's the group. And then Bill's like, oh, these are really interesting, and put a whole extra set of links. So Bill, let's dive in a little more deeply into some of the things that were maybe not the clickbait headline, but still pretty interesting to think about. What were some of the top sort of interesting things you noted in the lower parts of the survey?
I mean, there were a bunch of them. And so it was where they started looking at behaviors for one group of people versus another, like a bunch of things based on education level, and the reasons for quitting, people who had a college degree or higher, any college degree or higher, bachelor's degree or higher, I guess, 34% of them said, scheduling flexibility was one of the major issues. Working too few hours was 17%, and requiring a COVID vaccine was 8%, versus people who didn't have a bachelor's degree, 49%, so 15 percentage points higher, said flexibility was an issue. 35%, which is twice the 17% of the bachelor's degree people, said too few hours, and 21%, which is 2.5 times what the bachelor's people said for COVID vaccine. But when you think about it, those things to some degree make sense, that, flexibility for people with bachelor's degrees are more likely to be white collar people than blue collar, and that flexibility is sort of embedded in the job in the Zoom world. In fact, it created some more flexibility for those of us that were in that situation. Too few hours, again, similar thing. It's like hourly versus salaried. And the COVID vaccine, same thing. If you're working from home, companies are much less likely to, have a vaccine mandate because you're not coming into a location. And, one of the things I would call attention to is, everything I just said is sort of like, you have to be careful about like cause and effect, and whether or not education is the reason that people think differently, or is there some third variable? In this case, I think the third variable is the kind of work that you do when you have a certain amount of education versus the kind of work you do when you have less education. It's not saying it's impossible for people to be on opposite sides of that line, but people, with degrees tend to be more likely to be in white collar jobs and, office jobs, and, people with less education tend to be more likely in hourly jobs or, manual labor jobs, blue collar jobs. And that those have different requirements and different issues, different challenges. Anyone else? Russ, you want to bounce that to somebody?
Well, I'll add something to that, and then I'm going to ask for Heather your opinion on this. So you tell me if you think I'm right or wrong. I'm going to speculate. But I like where you're going with that, Bill, that maybe there's a third factor. But one of the things that I think, and there's some data on this in various studies, but I'd have to dig deeper. And I wonder, Heather, I know you read a lot of this stuff, so maybe or maybe you just intuit it a little differently than I do. But one of my thoughts here is, I think pre-pandemic, right, employers may have been more strict. And this is over time, this is actually becoming sort of a trend. Even prior to the pandemic, a lot of employers were questioning how strict they should be about degree requirements, right? Because the talent market was getting so tight. Some employers are like, you know what, well, we may pull back on this, or equivalent years of experience or equivalent skills. As the talent market got worse, particularly during COVID, and you had these mission critical jobs and you just needed a body in it, right? People who were talented but maybe didn't have a degree were able to get into jobs and roles that maybe normally they couldn't because the talent market was so tight. And so I wonder if, because there were opportunities that before were limited to folks with a higher education degree, where people without bachelor degrees going, wait a minute, I can now get that white collar job. I can now, switch into a more flexible job with all the other benefits that folks who have degrees traditionally kind of had access to. Does that sound right to you, Heather? Is there any, what are your thoughts on why this might have been the case?
So from what I know, I haven't seen any research on this, but I don't think, from what I have seen, that mindset has actually entered the white collar world yet. Some of the really interesting practices, so pre-pandemic, I want to say it was a few years pre-pandemic, Bed Bath & Beyond started this thing where instead of having an application process, they had a first to apply process. This is, of course, an in-store employee, but they really they went, what does MVP hiring look like? And they said, someone eager for a job is what MVP hiring looks like. And so that's what they did. And it was super interesting to see. I don't think we've seen that in the white collar world yet, because particularly in the last couple of months, I love HR memes. I'm an absolute nerd about them, but the number of HR memes around the resume process, the application process, with hiring the way it is, the processes are still the same. Submit your resume and then type everything that you just submitted into the ATS. Go through 6 rounds. It's if we're saying that hiring is such a challenge, why haven't we really tried to do what Frontline did, which is, what does MVP look like for hiring, so that we can stop complaining about how hard it is.
That's a great point. Matt, you have any thoughts on this one? This is sort of, I'm glad you pulled this one out, Bill. What do you think, Matt? Anything kind of jump out at you?
There's nothing that hasn't been said yet by these 2 great co-hosts right now. I think Heather is about to replace me in the podcast realm, but that's okay.
No, Matt. Well, how about this, Matt? Look a little deeper. So we talked about one of Bill's sort of findings there, which was, the different education levels. What are some of the other things that jumped out at you, maybe a little lower here on the on the findings?
I think number 4 on there, I gotta check it in our show notes, but I think number 4 was because of childcare issues.
Yeah.
Again, we could go back to the sample, the distribution of the sample and the ages there, and I would imagine this would be much higher on the list if we didn't have that. I forget what it was. 40% was 18 to 29, because that's probably not going to be a huge concern of theirs. I was surprised that it wasn't even a little bit higher, though. That wasn't in like instead of felt disrespected at work, we'd be looking at childcare issues, because that was a lot of the stuff that I was experiencing. I was hearing about from our clients, especially when you go into some of these blue collar jobs that we were just talking about, or you go into healthcare and stuff like that, and people aren't working from home. They still have to go into an office, a hospital, a factory, and they have to figure out ways to be able to have coverage for their kids, worry about their education and Zoom classrooms and all that sort of stuff. So it's around where I thought it would be a little bit higher, though.
I noticed the same thing too, Matt, and I think it's probably because both of us have young kids at home. But childcare is one of those ones that I equate it in the world of software to global capabilities. Like, it matters when it matters. And when it matters a lot. And so we have to address the fact that there is a significant share of this sample that, they may not have childcare responsibilities, so it's not going to go high on the list. But for the range, I bet you if you were to segment out the 30 to 49 group, I would venture to guess childcare is even higher on the list, like you're describing.
Yeah. And one thing that's funny is, like, you sort of think, work from home during COVID, childcare problems go away, but they don't. I think they get worse, because your childcare.
I was going to say, I'm going to venture to guess you do not have young kids in the house.
I do not. Well, not that I know of. But, it's like the kids are at home while you're working from home. And so you still have this challenge of, like, what to do with them, because the childcare facility is shut down or the school is shut down, and you have young kids at home. And you still have to get your job done.
It's worse than that, because you also had to educate your children. So,
right.
You had
Zoom schools.
You had to do the lessons plans, teach your child, and do work, and take care of the child, and feed them lunch because they weren't at school, and it was just a giant right? And most folks, it was challenging. Even those of us, my kids are in college now, so I saw this movie back pre-COVID, and it was challenging pre-COVID, right? It was challenging even when schools were open and everything else to balance everything. So to have that suddenly land in everyone's lap. Yeah, I'm with you, Matt. I'm surprised that didn't come up higher as well. But I think that is because, Heather, I'm really glad you brought up the age demographic, because I think that was a huge reason as to it's not maybe a little higher. Bill, before we go, you had some other great sort of call outs here from some of the lower metrics here. What else kind of jumped out at you down there?
All right. You're putting me on the spot. So
I am. Well, you wrote a whole page on it, Bill. I got to make sure your time was well spent.
Yeah. Well, first I need to clarify, these aren't Bill's, research observations. These are Bill reading Pew's research observations.
These are Bill's cutting and pasting observations, right?
Exactly. So I had, 3. I don't know if we have time for all of them. Last one's just kind of a funny observation. But the first one was about people who changed jobs, and what happened after they changed their jobs. And that in general, the people who changed jobs had similar assessments of their new jobs, regardless of what demographic group or groups they were in, with one big exception that they called out, which is 60% of men said that their current job, the new job, makes it easier for them to balance work and family, versus 48% of the women said the same thing. So it's significantly more of the men felt like work-life balance got easier with their new job. Going to leave that to Heather to comment on if she wants to, because I feel like anything I say is going to get me in trouble. But there's some obvious observations there.
Yeah, no, I actually, when I read that in your show notes, Bill, I was like, I chuckled to myself, and I was like, well, I wonder if this one might just have more to do with society than it does to do with work. And that's kind of where I left it too.
All right. Well, let me jump to my. Oh, go ahead.
Well, actually, I had one other comment on that, but it's not so much related to the childcare point as it is related to the gender point of the research. And I know we're specifically talking about this Pew research here, but one of the things that I observed from a correlation standpoint is there's more recent Pew research that just came out that said that young women in the 18 to 29 range are out earning men in several US cities. Like the broad research shows that the gender pay gap is far from closed, but in that spirit of, what are the gender dynamics of this research? And that does have a lot to do with pay and the conversation around pay. You can't help but notice an interesting correlation in things like childcare responsibilities, in things like, when young people move jobs, the gender pay gap is closing in some locations. Like there are definitely dynamics at play. But to your point about childcare and men versus women, or childcare responsibilities, I should say, I think striking that balance between what is work and what is life and society, that's where it gets really complex. And I don't think there's a Pew study, Gallup study, or any out there is reasonably going to figure that one out.
Right. I think we're just going to be watching that evolve over the coming years, but it's good that it's evolving in that direction.
I have a theory as to why young professional women or younger women in general have closed the pay gap. So people just entering the workforce, as to why, and women who jump jobs probably have closed the pay gap more effectively than women that have been in their role for a while. That's probably an entirely other episode. So I will keep that theory to myself. Although I will say, here's my spoiler for my theory. It has to do when most organizations watch pay equity very carefully. And I think they watch it more carefully in the hiring process than they do in the merit and pay increase process. So that
makes perfect sense.
That's my theory.
Because the hiring process, sort of a lot of the differentiating variables are unclear.
Yes. And a lot of laws have been put in place around the hiring process, right?
Right.
But we haven't really figured out how to handle the merit process properly and the advancement process and all that sort of stuff. I think that's my theory, but that's a whole other episode. What was your last one, Bill? I think you had one more thing you wanted to call out here.
Right. And then my funny observation, which is going to be funny because I said funny twice. It's not going to be.
It better be funny. You're really working this up.
Yeah, no, I killed it. The serious one is that of the people that change jobs, 53% of them said that they changed their field of work or their occupation when they changed jobs, which is, I think, huge. I don't have anything to compare it to other than, anecdotal and sort of 30 plus years of experience. But that is a high percentage of people changing. Kind of a funny additional thing they said about this is that workers younger than age 30 and those without postgraduate degrees are especially likely to have made that kind of change, which, another way of saying that is that people that don't know what they want to do and people, are likely to try something different, and people who have committed, years and years of education are unlikely to switch career paths. Both of those seem a little obvious. But the 53% changing what they do, I thought was pretty interesting and pretty telling. Anyone?
Well, I think that it's interesting that perhaps COVID was the catalyst for all of this. People were reevaluating a lot within their lives, including where they want to live, but also what they want to do with their life. And being in this sort of situation has allowed them to reevaluate what they value, where their skills are, and to try new things out. I'd be curious to see, in a normal year, what the percent is of a group like this that would change careers completely. 53% in an odd environment right now. I wonder what it'd be like 2 years from now or the year before COVID.
Right. Yeah, that was what I don't know the number, but I suspect it's much lower, or it was much lower and will again be much lower, or maybe not. Maybe this is a new, like it's becoming the new normal.
Yeah,
it'll get lower.
And I wonder how much of that also is related to some industries that were low risk became higher risk. So if you were in the travel or hospitality, maybe you decided that's not a good industry to be in, that kind of thing.
Right. Or getting more flexibility by changing, career paths from something, that's loosely scheduled to something that's rigidly scheduled. It actually solves a couple problems for people.
Yep.
The childcare problem and just sort of general, having multiple jobs.
All right, Bill, we're almost out of time, but we gotta hear your funny observation.
The mildly amusing thing is sort of near the end, where they say, I'm going to read this. They say, for the most part, workers who quit a job last year are now employed somewhere else and see their current work situation as an improvement over their most recent job. And I was just like, well, of course. Would you voluntarily quit your job to go to a worse job? It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. There's an inherent bias in the question. But it's good to see, people are, sort of upgrading as they choose. So that was my mildly amusing observation.
So when you said funny, you just meant somewhat interesting, not laugh out loud funny.
Exactly. Inside. I was laughing inside. It was a little ironic.
This is Pew Research we're talking about here. So I don't know if we're going to get laugh out loud.
Well, there you have it.
You don't want laugh out loud funny in your research.
That's right. You can't get a good joke. You need to work on well, in any case, that's what we thought of the Pew Research study. Thank you, Heather, so much for bringing that one to our attention. It's a great one. We would love to know what you think about this study and other studies. Let us know. Either send an email to us at coffee@payscale.com or reach out to us on Twitter over at Payscale. And we'll catch you next time on Comp and Coffee.
Comp and Coffee is a PayFactors production dedicated to the compensation community. We welcome your feedback. Send email to coffee@payfactors.com, tweet us at PayFactors, or share your thoughts in our PayFactors community tile. Until next time, keep your coffee hot and your data fresh.